All right, we've been talking a lot about education this month. Not even just on our Young Activist Night, but just variously it's come up because on our minds because a lot of our kids are going to school. Schools are opening up and a lot of things are not certain. We're not sure what's going to happen. And so I thought it'd be fitting to talk about one of the most consequential decisions made in America in regards to education. And that is Brown versus the Board of Education, the significance of it, and why it probably has not actually changed much when it comes to integration in the United States. But first we have to start off with little Linda Brown, who is walking. She's not walking to school, she's walking to the bus that is going to drive 2 miles to take her to school. She's walking across busy highways, and she's walking in the freezing cold in the middle of winter in Topeka, Kansas. She's walking to try and get to the bus to take her to her all-black elementary school, Monroe. Sometimes in the dead of winter when she's walking, her tears are freezing on her face. That's how cold it is. She is 7 years old. Sometimes she gets nearly halfway and stops and runs back home because it's just too much for her to walk to the bus to get to her school. She runs home to her mother, and this happens time and time again. And her parents wonder, why in the world do we have to keep sending our daughter to walk to the bus to travel 2 miles to the all-black school when 4 blocks away is a perfectly good elementary school? But that school is for whites only. Now, the NAACP had been trying to figure out how to challenge segregation in a way that would actually work. And a strategy is created by a very brilliant man named Charles Hamilton Houston. He's a Harvard law professor. And he goes through the South and he documents the black schools and takes pictures and video, compares them to the white schools. And he shows that a lot of these black schools are in bad shape, of course, and the white schools have no problems. So his strategy is to actually challenge the court on the law of the day, which is separate but equal. So he actually approaches it as if segregation is okay. We just need to make sure that the black schools are equal to the white. If you can do that, then no problem. And the brilliance of this is that none of these schools, counties, districts have any of the resources to make all of the black schools equal to the white schools. So eventually, if succeeded, it would be struck down. So on this premise, he argues case after case in state after state, travels throughout the South to prove this and wins these cases and builds a portfolio and a precedent to eventually be presented to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, he does not make it that far. He dies in 1950. And he had actually stopped practicing public law in 1938, but he had a protege, a Harvard Law graduate, that he had groomed for this, who had taken over these cases for the decade before. And it's a name you've heard before. He would eventually become a Supreme Court justice appointed under Lyndon B. Johnson. And his name is Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall finally gets the Supreme Court to see the cases, and it's actually a bundle of 5 cases from 5 different states under the name of Brown versus the Board of Education. They see it twice. They hear the arguments in 1952 and 1954. Well, why twice? In 1952, when they first began to argue it, the court realized there was a problem. See, the lower court of Kansas had actually ruled in favor of the school board based on the fact that the black schools were fairly on par compared to the white schools. And this was actually true. So this threw a wrench in the separate but equal approach that Marshall had inherited from Charles Hamilton Houston. But what the Supreme Court justices did was they gave him time to reorganize his argument, and they put the pressure on for him to prove that segregation actually puts black children at a disadvantage. And there was something that the Kansas lower court had written in their ruling for the school board, in that, in their words, the segregation does retard the education of the Negro. It gives them an inferiority complex. So now Marshall and his team was forced to lean in on the idea that there was a psychological effect that segregation had on black children. Enter the doll test. Two psychologists, Manning and her husband, Kenneth Clark, had done experiments in the 1940s with black children, and they showed them two dolls, one white and one black. And they would ask them, which doll would you want to play with? Which doll do you think is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? The white doll. Which doll do you think is pretty? Which one is ugly? And unfortunately, of course, they preferred the white doll in most instances and found the black doll to be inferior. So Marshall and his team convinced the Clarks to recreate the experiment and present the case for the 1954 hearing of Brown versus Board of Education. And now they had psychological basis that black children were being damaged up here thanks to segregation. Well, the Chief Justice at the time is newly appointed. His name is Earl Warren. He's the former governor of California. And Chief Justice Earl Warren would oversee numerous landmark cases regarding civil rights and others throughout the 50s and the 60s. And he does an amazing thing. He manages to guide his court, who was at one point divided before he took over, to a unanimous decision ruling that segregation is unconstitutional. The most famous quote from his opinion brief that he wrote was that separate but equal has no place in education. Sounds like a stunning win, right? But the problem is that the premise for this decision is based on a classic racist premise. It was the premise that black children in black schools with black teachers were being damaged psychologically because they weren't able to be in white schools sitting next to white children learning from white teachers. Chief Justice Earl Warren actually cited the lower court Kansas ruling that stated that children were being put at a disadvantage by being in all black schools. We know what happens, the decision happens, and there is tons of backlash in the white community. This, the record states clearly. But what you don't hear about is the backlash in the black community. A survey in 1955 states that half, maybe half, of blacks in the South agreed with the Brown decision. The New York Times wrote an article noting the indifference in some neighborhoods once the news had reached them. Many people actually considered people who put their black students in white schools abandoners of black schools. Surprisingly, to a lot of people, a majority of blacks were not interested in integration in education and other forms of life. Now, why? Well, let's go back to Linda Brown's school. On the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, Linda does a speaking tour. She goes around college campuses and various places and she talks about something that is not mentioned in the court briefing or any of the cases. And it was the fact that her teachers were excellent and her classrooms were fantastic. Linda Brown recalls that she would go to the grocery store and see her teachers, and they would be invested in her life outside of the classroom as well. Now, Oliver Brown, who Brown versus Board of Education is actually named after, which is her father, Linda's father, had to be convinced to sign on to the case, not the other way around. Leola Brown had actually grown up in Topeka and went to the same school, Monroe. And she noted that even at the time, she had received a top-notch education. The Browns were not concerned with the quality of education they received from Monroe. They had no qualms with the materials, with the resources, least of all the teachers who taught at Monroe. They simply wanted the choice to send their daughter to a school in their neighborhood if they so choose to do so. But of course, the United States government isn't simply going to grant black people a choice because it's the right thing to do or even an American thing to do. The first thing they must do is have pity. They must prove that the power to provide ample education to students is in their hands, and that it would be immoral of them to deny black students access to white education. Now, what does white education mean? Well, Linda Brown, in her speeches, would also read a letter sent by a white superintendent to a black teacher, and it was a letter of termination addressed to Miss Buchanan. White education meant far fewer black educators. There were about 80,000 teachers in the South during Brown versus Board of Education. Over the next decade, tens of thousands of teachers would lose their jobs. You see, white parents were not going to send their white children to schools to sit next to black children, and on top of that, allow a black teacher to tell them what to do and guide them. That was just too much to stomach. So the board and the superintendents had to make decisions. Of course, they said it was based on merit, and that's why they had to choose the white teachers. But somehow still, the top-rated, most highly educated teachers in black schools were fired, terminated, and did not have their contracts renewed once black schools were closed and combined with white schools. Mind you, they were so equipped for this job because it was one of the few jobs that black professionals who were educated were allowed to pursue. Integration had always been about integrating black children into white schools. Never once had it been about integrating black teachers into these schools. Now, to this day, school systems in the United States are still not integrated, but we have to ask if that's actually the goal. So now we have black children in white classrooms with white teachers sitting next to white students. The question we have to ask ourselves, are these black children, do they feel better now about the little black doll than they did before? Do they feel better about themselves? Have we actually worked to alleviate the psychological damage of a child who is in a classroom with people who look like him or her, learning from a teacher who has the same skin as they do? Now, we know that that's obviously not the case. And we know that, unfortunately, black children choosing a white doll is not simply a matter of segregation. So the question we really have to ask ourselves is, does Brown versus the Board of Education actually solve the problem? Or is it once again white supremacy masking itself as humanitarianism? That's the thing to think about. And that's it. Thank you.